Hello, I'm Andrew Preece, and this is the first in a series of talks on exploring the gospel of Jesus. The first talk is the longest, and it considers historical evidence supporting the gospel message. And then the subsequent talks, which are shorter, look at particular aspects of the gospel. So, firstly, we'll consider why bother. In other words, what's the relevance of the message? Why does it matter? Secondly, a brief section on some terminology. And thirdly, the longest part will be focusing on evidence for the historical reliability of the gospel message. So why bother? Many religions and human societies have believed that justice matters and we should seek to be just. And it's also recognised that there is a lot of injustice in the world. Bad people often get away with injustice. Good people often suffer injustice. And societies have also believed, many, that there is a life after death and that God will then ensure that justice is done. However, there are many other people who would see this as wishful thinking. They would say either there is no God or there's no life after death. And so effectively injustice has the last word much of the time. Like many other religious teachings, the Bible urges us to be just, and it says that God will judge people after death. Is this belief in life after death and God's justice merely wishful thinking? The gospel bases its claims about life after death and so on, first and foremost on the life, death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. A key claim of the gospel message is that 3 days after his execution, Jesus rose from the dead. His body was no longer in his tomb, and he appeared to his followers then over a period of 40 days. There are a number of rock tombs like the one shown in the photograph here that exist in Jerusalem, which are still there to this day, and they resemble the description of the tomb in which Jesus' body was laid. So it's very likely one of these tombs may well have been the tomb that was used for Jesus' body. The Bible tells us that Jesus appeared both to individuals and to groups on multiple occasions after his resurrection. It says that he spoke to them, he ate meals with them, they could see him, they could hear him, and they could touch him. So it was a physical event. It was something that was physically discernible. And there's a little cartoon there depicting Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene after his resurrection just outside the tomb. On hearing reports of Jesus' resurrection, many of his followers were initially sceptical, and they were only convinced when he appeared to them too. Most remarkable of all is Saul of Tarsus, who became the Apostle Paul. He initially persecuted the followers of Jesus, and he had many of them imprisoned. But Jesus also appeared to him on the road to Damascus, and within days he began preaching the gospel that he had tried to destroy. Paul became probably the greatest Christian missionary of all time, and ultimately was beheaded in AD 67 on the Appian Way near to Rome for preaching the gospel. And the Appian Way is a Roman road which runs from Rome to Brindisi. There's a photograph of it as it is today, and so you can see what it's like now. And as I say, that is where the Apostle Paul ultimately was beheaded. Paul's own letters refer several times to his zealous persecution of Christians and how that changed because the risen Jesus appeared to him. And it must have been convincing to change his mind. It was the last thing he expected to happen. For more about Paul and the resurrection, you can have a look at some supporting information that goes with this talk, So there is a file that you can look at, exploring the Gospel of Jesus, supporting information. To sum up so far, the Bible stresses the importance of Jesus' resurrection. It claims that it was a physical event, not just a spiritual one, that it is supported by substantial physical evidence with many eyewitnesses who refuse to deny it, even in the face of persecution and death. And the Bible teaches that the whole human race will be raised to life before the Last Judgment, just as Jesus was. Now, a short section just giving you a little bit of terminology, which should be helpful. The Bible is divided into two main parts. So firstly, the Old Testament, it's abbreviated to OT, which predates the time of Jesus. And then the New Testament, abbreviated to NT, which covers a period in the 1st century AD, so the first 100 years after Jesus' birth, in which Jesus of Nazareth is the central character. And the word gospel comes from a Greek word, euangelion, which means good news. So that's the meaning of the word gospel, good news. What is the New Testament? Well, there are 27 documents in the New Testament that were originally written in Greek. There are 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, which tell us about Jesus' life and ministry. Then the Acts of the Apostles, which describes the spread of the early church across the Roman Empire from Jerusalem to the capital city, Rome. Then there are 21 letters from early Christian leaders to both churches and individuals. And finally, the book of Revelation, which is a prophecy about Jesus' return and the Last Judgment. Now, you might wonder, why was the New Testament written in Greek? Well, Alexander the Great, who lived from 356 to 323 BC, conquered much of the Middle East, and he spread the Greek language and culture over that area. And even after the Romans came along and conquered the western part of Alexander's empire, the Greek language continued to be the international language in the Roman Empire for many years. Interestingly, Jesus probably spoke some basic Greek himself, because Greek, for example, was used for trade. And we know that Jesus worked as a carpenter, so it's very likely he would have traded to some extent using the Greek language. Although we also know that Aramaic was his mother tongue. An interesting little sideline on that is that the Greek of the Gospels, for the most part, is rather what we might call rough and ready Greek, very basic Greek, sometimes referred to as Koine or common Greek. And that makes sense because for the most part it was written by people who were speaking Greek as a second language, so it wasn't their first language. And however, when you take this rather rough and ready Greek of the New Testament and you translate it back into Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke, there are some passages in the Gospels, not everywhere by any means, but a few places, where when you do this word for word translating back from Greek into Aramaic, it comes out as Aramaic poetry. And that strongly suggests that Jesus probably used some poetry in his teaching, which would have made it more memorable. And it also suggests that the gospel writers were careful to preserve Jesus' words, that when they translated it into Greek, they tried to do it word for word. It didn't always come out as the best form of Greek, but it was an accurate representation of what Jesus himself had said. So now we're going to think about evidence for the historical reliability of the gospel message. Firstly, a little bit about faith and facts. We can't prove the Bible in the way that you could prove, say, a mathematical formula. In fact, there are very few things in life that you can prove like that. But there is plenty of historical evidence which supports it. how do historians examine the past and get at the truth about what happened? Well, this is sometimes referred to as the legal historical method. And the reason is that it's also the method that is used by lawyers in the law courts. And the basic idea is that you cross-examine the available sources, which may include written or spoken accounts, and any artifacts that exist, such as coins or inscriptions in stone. And of course, in modern trials, things like DNA evidence are used. And when you cross-examine the sources, you compare them to check various features. So, for example, you ask about their date. When were these things produced? When were they written? Their authorship, who was behind this, who produced this artifact or this document. You try to consider any motivations and biases of the authors, which will probably be apparent in the things that they said, and whether the different sources are independent of each other. Did they collude together, or were they writing independently? And also, are they consistent or are they contradictory? And so on. So that's the basic approach that is used to reconstruct what happened in the past. And as I say, that's used both in law courts and also by historians. We can also ask about the internal consistency of the New Testament. So the New Testament was written by at least 9 different writers, and their account of events can be cross-checked against each other. So, for example, Paul mentions his conversion on the road to Damascus in several of his letters, and Luke also records it in more detail in the Acts of the Apostles. And so we can compare Paul's description of what happened with Luke's and see how they match up. The 4 Gospels and Acts provide various accounts of people meeting Jesus after his resurrection, and again, we can compare those different accounts with each other. There are also non-Christian sources, various Jewish and Roman sources from that time, which corroborate numerous details that are recorded in the New Testament, such as, for example, Jesus' crucifixion by Pontius Pilate and the beheading of John the Baptist by King Herod Antipas. And there are lots of other smaller details that are mentioned by these non-Christian sources. And the photograph there is a photo of a statue of a man called Cornelius Tacitus. That statue is located outside the Austrian Parliament building. And Tacitus was born around 55 AD, and he's widely regarded as the greatest Roman historian. And he mentions Jesus' crucifixion by Pilate, and he also confirms many other details that are mentioned in the New Testament. He tells us a little bit, for example, about Pontius Pilate and some of the other rulers that were around at the time, and so on. These non-Christian sources also confirm various early Christian beliefs. They tell us what the Christians believe and taught. They describe the rapid growth and spread of the church across the Roman Empire, and the persecution of Christians, for example, by the Emperor Nero, who ruled from AD 54 to 68. And for a summary of those non-Christian sources that corroborate a wide range of details recorded in the New Testament, again, have a look at the supporting information that goes with this talk. So now we're going to have a think about the transmission of the New Testament. In other words, how has the New Testament story come down to us today? And so we can think of 4 main stages in that transmission process. Firstly, there were the eyewitnesses who met Jesus, who saw him for themselves. Then the writers who wrote down what the eyewitnesses said. In some cases that was the eyewitnesses themselves, in other cases not, and we'll say a bit more about that. And then the copyists who copied those written documents by hand over the subsequent centuries, remembering, of course, that printing hadn't been invented at that time, so documents had to be copied by hand. So we'll think about the copyists, and then finally the translators who have translated the New Testament from the original language Greek into modern languages such as English. And the question we need to think about is, are there any weak links in this chain of transmission? So I'm going to consider each of these steps in turn, starting with the translators and then working backwards in time. So firstly, the translators. And in the English language, we have a good selection of lexicons, sort of dictionaries translating from Greek to English and back, and commentaries on the New Testament, which help to clarify the meaning of the original words. And those are written, incidentally, by scholars from places like Oxford and Cambridge University, who've studied these matters in detail. We also have a wide range of modern English translations of the Bible. So I've listed a few of them there. For example, the Revised Standard Version, the New International Version, the Jerusalem Bible, the New American Standard Bible, and the Good News Bible. And there are more besides. And these may be compared with each other to see that they agree. And in general, if you do compare a given passage in any of those translations, what you will generally find is that the differences are largely differences of style rather than content. So, for example, one might be written in more colloquial English or another in more standard English. But the basic meaning is the same between the different translations. The various translations, many of them have been produced by committees of scholars. And so usually what would happen is a particular book or passage will be translated by a scholar who's an expert in that area, and then other scholars will review his or her work and make comments on it, and as a result they seek to improve and refine the translation and to provide a consistent approach as well across the whole of the New Testament and the Bible. So that's the way the translations are produced. And so we can have a high degree of confidence that the translations are accurate and reliable, and there are also many readable ones that are in good modern English. And now let's have a think about the copyists who copied the original versions of the New Testament over the centuries following that time. There are over 5,700 surviving manuscripts of the New Testament, which range in date from the 2nd to the 16th century. From the 16th century onwards, of course, you get printed copies, so it's then possible to produce hundreds and thousands of reliable copies relatively easily. The earliest of these surviving manuscripts is dated at 120 AD, and that's just a few verses, a small fragment from John's Gospel. Moving forwards in time, there are some large portions of the New Testament that survive from 200 AD onwards. So, for example, you get collections, say, all four Gospels or all the letters of Paul and so on. And these large portions, when you combine them, you can produce the whole of the New Testament, but different manuscripts providing large portions of the New Testament from dated about 200 AD onwards. And then the earliest complete copies that have survived of the New Testament, we have a couple. There is Codex Vaticanus, which was copied around 335 AD. And as the name suggests, that is kept in the Vatican Library in Rome. And then Codex Sinaiticus, which was copied around 350 AD, and that is in the British Library in London. And that was found in a Greek Orthodox monastery on Mount Sinai, hence the name Codex Sinaiticus. And based on some very pessimistic assumptions, you can calculate the increase in copying errors over time. And I've got a little illustration of that on the next slide. So this graph shows the percentage of words in 10 surviving copies for which at least 5 copies are correct. So I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. So we're looking at copies produced over a period of time, so some dating from maybe 100 years after the original, others dating from 500, 600, 700, 800 years after the original, and how the number of the amount of copying errors could increase over time. And using quite pessimistic assumptions, as I say, you can arrive at that sort of curve. And so, for example, what that's telling you is, suppose you had 10 surviving copies of the New Testament that were dated 500 years after the original. The majority of copies of a given word will be correct for 99% of the words. That's what that is telling you. So, and obviously, what you tend to find is that and that when we say the majority, so the idea is if you've got 10 copies and 5 of them have the correct word, so at least half have the correct word, obviously those will all be identical. The other 5 have all got some kind of error in. Obviously the errors won't generally be the same, so there might be spelling mistakes, there might be a word that's missed out, there might be a word that's added in accidentally, and so the errors are relatively easy to spot because they're all different, whereas the correct ones are easy to spot because they tend to be the same. They are the same, of course. So that gives you an idea of how copying errors might change over time. And bear in mind, of course, that we've considered there having 10 surviving copies at a particular point in time. In fact, if you go 500 years after the original of the New Testament, there are actually hundreds of surviving copies. Now, they're not all completely independent of each other, of course, because some of them have been copied from other copies with the same original copy. And there are ways of discerning that as well, which the experts can pick out. But nevertheless, there are many copies surviving, certainly by you get 500 years after the original. So for more details on that copying error calculation and the surviving New Testament manuscripts, again, have a look at the supporting information that goes with this talk. There's a photograph of Codex Sinaiticus from the British Library, which, as I say, was copied around 350 AD. You can see that it's in very good condition. It's easy to read. I've been to the British Library and I've seen that copy, and as I say, it's in very good condition and it's certainly very readable. Incidentally, that word codex just basically means a book in the modern form. Before the time of the New Testament, documents were generally copied as scrolls. So the Old Testament, for example, originally would have been written on scrolls that were rolled up. However, after the time of the New Testament, you find that books, more like our modern books, start to appear. And it's thought that actually it may have been Christians who invented that modern form of book, where you have the pages of the book between a couple of hard copies, usually hard boards as either end, and then stitched together in the middle in that way. And it's believed that Christians may have invented that during times of persecution. So what used to happen was, when the church was being persecuted, the persecutors would often try to seize copies of the Bible, and they would burn those books. And obviously those books were very precious to the Christians, not least because it took a lot of time to copy them by hand, and so they wanted to protect them. And so what they probably decided to do was to get the original scrolls, slice them into sheets, and then stick the sheets together and put them between a couple of boards, and that was the beginning of the modern book. And then those, in that form, they were easier to hide and easier to transport if you needed to flee quickly with your copies. So that's just a little bit about the surviving copies. There was a world-class textual critic. Textual critics, incidentally, are the people who study ancient manuscripts and compare the available manuscripts in order to reconstruct the original text based on the surviving copies. And there was a world-class textual critic, Sir Frederick Kenyon, who lived from 1863 to 1952. And he spent much of his career studying the New Testament and refining the text and so on. And he commented, "The last foundation for any doubt that the scriptures have come down to us substantially as they were written has now been removed." And that was based obviously on this large number of surviving copies that we now have available. And one other point that's worth mentioning on this is that the copyists reliably bridge most of the 2,000-year gap between us and Jesus. A lot of people might think, well, you know, Jesus lived 2,000 years ago. How can we really be sure about something that's happened 2,000 years ago? It's a long time. But the thing to realize is that because we have very high confidence that the copies of the Bible we have today are accurate copies of what was originally written down nearly 2,000 years ago, we can say that most of that time gap is simply covered by those copies, which, as I say, we can be very confident about. So they take us right back to within a generation of Jesus' own life. And so the real time gap to consider is between the original writers who wrote down the message in the first place and the events that they were describing. Not 2,000 years, but a much shorter period of time. Now, the actual gap between the original writers and the events they're describing, it varies, but for most of the New Testament, it ranges between about 15 and 35 years after Jesus' death. In other words, within living memory of those who knew Jesus during his ministry. And it's worth remembering that Jesus was quite a young man when he died, probably about, as far as we know, about 33. And his disciples generally were younger, probably mostly in their 20s when Jesus was going around preaching. And so they lived then subsequently, most of them for the next 30, 40 years. And so they were still alive when these documents, when the New Testament was written down. So they were written down within living memory of Jesus' own life. So we've thought about the copyists. Now let's move on to think about the original writers of the New Testament. And we're going to focus on the Acts of the Apostles here for several reasons. Firstly, Acts is actually the longest book in the New Testament, and it was also written by the author of the longest Gospel, Luke. Luke's Gospel, it has fewer chapters than Matthew, but it is, if you count the number of words, Luke is actually the longest of the four Gospels. So if we can show that Luke is a reliable recorder of events in the book of Acts, then it also gives us confidence that he was a reliable writer in his Gospel as well. And the book of Acts also mentions most of the other New Testament authors, so it gives us some insight into them, into their character, into the things that they said and did. And the book of Acts claims to record the original gospel message that was preached by Jesus' apostles after his death and resurrection. So it takes us right back to the original gospel that was preached by the apostles themselves. So firstly, let's consider the date of the book of Acts. When was it written? Well, the internal evidence indicates that it was finished around 65 AD, or possibly a little bit earlier, perhaps 63, 64 AD. One of the main reasons we can say that is that the main character in the second half of the book of Acts is the Apostle Paul, and we know from other sources that Paul was executed around 67 AD, and he was under house arrest in Rome around 65 AD. He was actually subsequently released and then later rearrested and executed. And the book of Acts ends relatively abruptly when Paul is still under house arrest in Rome in about 65 AD. So, as he is such a leading figure within the book, it would be strange if the book had been written later. It would be strange not to have mentioned his death, his subsequent death, a couple of years later. And so the fact that Acts ends very abruptly at that point suggests that was when the book was completed. There are other reasons for thinking that as well, but we haven't got time to go into all of those now. Anyway, in the 19th century, there were a group of theologians at the University of Tübingen in Germany, and they came up with a theory about the book of Acts, which said that it was actually written around 160 to 180 AD. And so that would make it more than 100 years after the events that it describes, and hence they argued that Acts was historically unreliable. Now, there was a man named Sir William Ramsay who lived from 1851 to 1939, and he was a famous historian and archaeologist, and he initially accepted this Tübingen theory about the Book of Acts. And William Ramsay embarked on a 20-year archaeological expedition of the Mediterranean region, focusing on artifacts from the 1st century AD. And over the course of that expedition, he made numerous discoveries, and he published his discoveries in a whole host of papers and books. And incidentally, it's worth saying one of the reasons underlying the Tübingen theory was this. There are a number of Roman writers, such as the Roman writer Cicero, who were writing around the same time as the New Testament writers, some a bit earlier, some a bit later. And there are certain points in their writings where they contradict things that are said in the book of Acts. And the Tübingen theologians assumed that the Roman writers must have got it right, and therefore Luke had got it wrong. However, as Sir William Ramsay made these various discoveries, as he went along, more and more he found things which confirmed the accuracy of what Luke had written in the book of Acts, and contradicted in these various incidents things that the Roman writers had said. And after his expedition, Ramsay came to the conclusion, which is written there. He said Luke is an historian of the first rank. And Ramsay was a good judge of that because he himself was an historian of the first rank. And for more about Sir William Ramsay and his expedition and his discoveries, again, have a look at the supporting information that goes with this talk. Just to give you an idea of some of the things that Ramsay discovered, he dug up artifacts that were, for example, monuments that might list the officials who ruled in a particular Roman city or province, and the titles that those officials were given. And time again, Luke gave exactly the right titles to the Roman officials, exactly the right locations, exactly the right regions, whereas the Roman writers were sometimes right, sometimes wrong. And this was what lay behind Ramsay's conclusions about Luke. So we thought about the translators, we thought about the copyists, we thought about the writers. Now, finally, let's consider the eyewitnesses who saw Jesus during his lifetime and who were the original people who told the story of Jesus. There are at least 4 reasons for believing that the apostles, Jesus' closest followers, were honest. The first is to say that they were willing to die for their story after the resurrection of Jesus. Now, they weren't particularly courageous by nature. The Gospels themselves tell us, for example, that when Jesus was arrested, they all fled. They abandoned him. They deserted him, despite the fact that they'd all promised to go with him to the death. So they were not naturally courageous, but after Jesus' death and resurrection, they were willing to die for their story, which suggests very strongly they were telling the truth. People will die for something that they believe to be true, but they would hardly die for something that they knew to be a lie. And we know that all of the apostles ultimately were put to death for preaching the gospel, with the exception of the apostle John, who lived into old age. But he too was imprisoned for preaching the gospel on the island of Patmos. And so he also was persecuted for his preaching. So they were willing to die for their story. A second reason for believing that they were honest is that many of their contemporaries believed them. We know, even from non-Christian writers, that the church spread and grew very rapidly in the early decades after Jesus' death. And the fact that many people believed the message suggests that the apostles had credibility, that they had integrity, and people could see that, and so were willing to believe what they were saying. And a third reason for believing they were honest is that the Gospels don't hide their faults. So I've already mentioned the fact that they abandoned Jesus when he was arrested. So the Gospels are very honest about that, the faults of the apostles. And not just that, there are lots of other small incidents in the Gospels that don't particularly show them in a great light. So, for example, they had petty squabbles among themselves. Jesus rebuked them. Jesus often had to explain things to them carefully because they didn't understand initially what he was saying, and so on. So the Gospels don't hide their faults, and that, again, if they were honest about that, then it suggests they were honest the rest of the time. And also, a final point to make on this is, could they have invented Jesus? These were very ordinary men, fishermen, tax collectors. They weren't. There was nothing special about them, and yet Jesus is widely regarded, even by people who aren't Christians, as one of the greatest religious teachers of all time. Could they have invented the amazing life of Jesus, his parables, his miracles, his encounters with various people? And another thing to bear in mind is he often challenged their preconceived ideas. Sometimes they were surprised or even shocked by the things that Jesus said and did. And again, that comes out quite often in the Gospels. So could these men have invented the unique character of Jesus? Again, this suggests that the story they've given us is an honest account of a real person. So we may accept that they were being honest, they intended to tell the truth, but then someone might say, well, perhaps they just forgot a lot of the details. Maybe it's not a very accurate account. Perhaps over the years before it was finally written down, they gradually forgot things, and so maybe it's not a very accurate account. Well, there are 4 reasons, again, at least, for believing that it is an accurate account. The first thing is that there were 12 main eyewitnesses to the life of Jesus. And of course, many other people. We're told of the crowds who followed Jesus, who saw the things that he did, who heard the things that he said. And many of those people ultimately joined the church. And so there were many eyewitnesses, and particularly the disciples, the apostles who'd been with him during his ministry. And so if one of the apostles was, say, preaching and giving an example of something that Jesus said or did, you can imagine that the other apostles there would have been able to add to that and correct it if there was any detail that was wrong. And they could say, yes, do you remember Jesus said this as well, or he did that, or this is the way it happened, you know. So they had the support of others around them to remember what had happened. Also, we shouldn't forget that these people spent the rest of their lives telling people about Jesus. And as they repeated it, if you repeat something, then it etches it on your memory. So, for example, if you're doing a presentation like this, and you've done it several times for different audiences, after a while you get to know it off by heart. And so they retold the story often, which would have etched it on their memories. A third reason for believing that they were accurate is that the events that are described in the Gospels are memorable in character. I mean, you wouldn't exactly forget someone rising from the dead. And then there are all the memorable parables that Jesus told, the miracles that he performed, his crucifixion, which came as a huge shock to his disciples, and of course ultimately his resurrection. Now these are memorable events. It's not just a sort of boring day in the office. These are the kind of things you'd remember for the rest of your life. So the events are memorable in character. And finally, as we've already said, there are good reasons for believing that they were written down within living memory. And so, for example, Luke tells us at the beginning of his gospel, Luke himself didn't meet Jesus in person, but at the beginning of his gospel, he tells us how he had been and interviewed those who were eyewitnesses of the life of Jesus and written down what they had said. So he had written it down within living memory. Finally, the best way to appreciate the honesty and accuracy of the New Testament is to read it all yourself, carefully and prayerfully. God speaks to those who listen. Now, as I said at the beginning, this is the first in a series of short talks with slides accompanying. There are also some videos covering this theme, and most of the talks just last 10 to 15 minutes, so they're quite short. You're very welcome to listen to those, to download them and share any or all of them with other people as well. There is further reading on this topic, again in the supporting information that is mentioned. So if you'd like to read up some more, you could have a look at that. And if you have any questions about this series or on related topics or about the Christian Workplace Group, please feel free to contact me and I'll do my best to help with that.